Okay, Sherry, you're good to go.
Thanks, Gabby. Warm greetings from Southern California. My name is Sherry Miller, and it's my privilege to serve on the board of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. And it's also my privilege to welcome each of you to this very special program. And in my welcome, I want to include the students from Holton Arms School in Bethesda who have a group attending this very special program featuring Dr. Robert M. Gates. Dr. Gates, it's an honor to have you here and to say thank you for all you do to use PDCA's tagline to strengthen America's dialogue with the world. Our co-sponsors for this special program, today's webinar, the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, and also the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications. Our tech hosts, Gabby Stahl, the PDCA Hans Tom Tuck Graduate Fellow, as well as Haley Pottle, a rising professional member of PDCA. They asked me to remind you to put any technical issues you may have in the chat box and to pose your questions for Dr. Gates along with your name and affiliation in the Q&A box. Today, Michael McCary will serve as our moderator and pose questions to Dr. Gates in the first part of our program. Michael is a PDCA board member. He co-chairs our advocacy committee we call ACE. He also has served on the Hill. He's had assignments as a Foreign Service Officer, and he spent 21 years at the helm of the Alliance for International Exchange. Before Mike begins, PDCA active member Senator Gordon Humphrey will frame our program and introduce Dr. Gates. I do want to use this public moment to thank Senator Humphrey, who served in the US Senate between 1979 and 1990, for connecting us with Dr. Gates and for his many contributions to PDCA. Senator Humphrey, you truly are a champion of public diplomacy. Over to you, Senator Humphrey.
Thank you, Sherry. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. We're honored this afternoon and privileged to host Dr. Robert M. Gates, who served 2 presidents of the United States as Secretary of Defense, and prior to that served the nation as the director of the Center Intelligence Agency, CIA, during a 27-year career, during which he rose to the very top. Dr. Gates is a graduate of the College of William and Mary, where he is now chancellor, and of Indiana University. He holds a doctorate in Soviet and Russian history from Georgetown University. We can safely say that, based on his writings, that Dr. Gates shares the opinion of most of us that the United States has failed in recent decades to effectively use public diplomacy to safeguard our national security. In December of 2022, Dr. Gates convened a forum to address the central question, quote, what concrete actions can the U.S. take to reimagine and reconstitute our strategic communications and public diplomacy tools to integrate those with our other instruments of national power? A link to the forum's report can be found on our website. Further, Dr. Gates has written extensively on this vital national security matter. In an important Washington Post article a few months ago, Dr. Gates asserted that in the realm of messaging foreign citizens, quote, Russia and China are running rings around us, close quotes. One could hardly put it more succinctly or more factually, in my opinion. Perhaps in asking questions of Dr. Gates this afternoon, we can get to the bottom line explicitly what can be done, should be done by the president and the Congress to rectify this dangerous defect in our national security. Dr. Gates, welcome.
Thanks, Gordon. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Well, Dr. Gates, let's get started. Thanks again for being with us. I know our members and most of the folks in the audience, I'm including myself, have been greatly heartened by your comments and writings on the subject of public diplomacy. I know everybody's looking forward to hearing from you. Before we get into that specifically, I wonder if we might start by providing some context on the challenges strategic challenges the U.S. faces around the globe right now and the scope of those.
Well, I guess the way to begin answering that question is to ask how much time we have. I don't think we have faced more challenges in many, many decades. For the first time, we face an alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, all with the same narrative of the West is in decline and the United States is in decline, and this is their moment, and they want to change the international order to suit their interests. Three of those countries together within 5 to 7 years will have twice as many nuclear weapons as the United States has, a situation we have never faced before. For the first time since the Korean War, we face aggressive major powers in both Europe and in Asia. We face powers that have sophisticated scientific, technological, and military capabilities, particularly China. No one in living memory, no one alive today, I should say, has witnessed an environment in which the United States faces a power that has those capabilities comparable to our own. And then we face the complications of a war in Ukraine, prompted by the Soviet invasion or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We now face a war in the Middle East, provoked by Hamas, and great tensions in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, and over Taiwan itself. So there's no shortage of challenges. We face transnational challenges, the environment, pandemics, and terror, and we still face a problem of terrorism. So I think the United States really faces more and more complex international environment than any of us can ever remember.
Thank you. What in your view, what does U.S. public diplomacy need to better respond to this situation?
Well, I think for openers, it needs a strategy. It needs coherent coordination, and it needs additional resources. We have, as the report Gordon referred to makes clear, we have 14 departments of government and 48 agencies, each of which has some strategic communications capability. As best anyone can tell, there is no coordination or coherence to any of that. They don't talk to each other. They don't know what each other is doing for the most part, and each goes its own way. So and then there's really no strategy, as I indicated. What are we trying to accomplish? What is the objective? What is our narrative? How do we counter the narrative of particularly the Chinese? On resources, even before Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao in China allocated $7 billion to create a strategic communications capability for China. There's not a single country on the planet today that does not have access to Chinese radio networks, television networks, or internet. And then we face of course, the challenges associated with Belt and Road and other global policies by the Chinese. So the first thing that we need is a strategy, and then we need to figure out how best to implement that strategy.
I'd like to talk about resources. I share your concern about it. I've been working on that a long time in terms of appropriations. We obviously need expanded capacity, but since 9/11, when there was a big bump up in exchange funding, the best we get from presidential budget requests or appropriations committees is coverage for inflation. And this seems to be the case regardless of the party. And now we have a radical Republican right, where we had an amendment last few weeks ago to the House Appropriations Bill that didn't pass. It was Rep. Briggs from Arizona, founder of the Freedom Caucus, that would have removed all funding for the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Not only the programs, but the Bureau itself would have been gone. That didn't pass happily. But what do we need to do to move the needle on resources, in your opinion? What can we do in organizations like ours?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be done is to educate, and I will say this: Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have done something no other human being alive has been able to do, and that's bring Republicans and Democrats together in the Congress. There is a pretty broad consensus in Congress on the need, above all, to challenge China, and to a considerable extent also Russia. So I think the first thing that needs to be done is to educate members of Congress as to the extent of what the Chinese and the Russians are up to, and not just in disinformation, but rather these global networks promoting the Chinese narrative that China has an alternative form of governance and of economic development that works, that can get infrastructure done, that is effective, that brings billions of people, or millions of people rather, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, compared with the paralysis in the democracies, and above all in the United States. It's a narrative around the world that the West, that the United States is in decline. We've passed our prime, and that the future belongs to China and to the authoritarian states, also like Russia. So the first thing I think needs to be done is to educate the Congress, and to a lesser extent the public, but it's the Congress that really needs to pay attention to the degree they're concerned about China. And we see that all the time in legislation relating to technology transfer and so on and so forth. They need to understand that this strategic communications advantage on the part of the Chinese is incredibly important as well. And to any kind of ability to compete with the Chinese, particularly, I would say, in the global South. And then I think what has to happen before you can begin to ask for resources is to have a strategy. How are we going to counter that capability on the part of the Chinese? The Russians, the Chinese, there is a difference in the narratives of the two, although they both have in common decline of the West, decline of the United States. But where they differ is China also offers a positive message of here's what works, our system works, here's an alternative. The Russian strategic communications is almost singularly negative, and it also includes a huge amount of disinformation, of trying to skew global views and so on. So they're very complementary, but there's a little difference of emphasis. And so how do we counter each of those, both structurally and programmatically? And I think there's really no consensus at this point on how to do that. And I realize the administration's got its hands full with all that's going on in the world, but we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And we need to develop this strategy, because I think you can't really, as the old saying in the intelligence community used to go, You can't beat something with nothing. And if you don't have a strategy, if you don't have a proposal for a strategy, then it's very difficult to make the case for resources.
Well, could part of that strategy be, in your judgment, a return to recreating a single purpose federal agency to lead public diplomacy? A lot of people, of course, in PDCA, or you, myself included, were USAA officers. And I think we now have fewer public diplomacy officers deployed than we did in 1999 when the merger happened. We have fewer posts. And of course, as you point out, the Chinese have more of both. I mean, would something like that, is the time come for something, for a dramatic move like that? Is that, and would it be politically possible?
Well, I think the latter point you make is really the key one. I think there's no appetite in the current environment on the Hill or in the administration for the creation of a significant new federal agency. And what we suggest, one thing we suggested in the forum report on this was maybe an approach, and this is not the only approach you could take, but one alternative would be to create and empower a position in the State Department comparable to the coordinator in the Bush administration, the coordinator for PEPFAR, for the President's Emergency Response to deal with the AIDS, HIV pandemic in Africa. The person who held that job didn't control all the agencies, but under orders from President Bush, he did control their budgets on HIV, on AIDS, HIV. So any program in any agency that had to do with that problem had to be approved and coordinated through the AIDS coordinator at the State Department. So an intermediate step, if you're not able to create a new agency, is how do you empower somebody who perhaps has a position that reports directly to the Secretary of State, who participates in the Deputies Committee or the Principals Committee in the NSC, who can bring together all these disparate agencies and departments and have a cohesive strategy where each agency has a piece of it, but there is an overall strategy that's coherent and makes sure that we're messaging consistently on issues around the world. And also, I think it's important that the position be in the State Department. First of all, our experience with the NSC taking an operational role on anything is pretty disastrous. So I think that would be a big mistake to put it in the NSC. It's not an operational entity. It needs to be in an operating department, but very closely tied in with the NSC, whose responsibility is, in fact, coordinating what the whole government does on these issues. But I think also another reason for having this coordinator in state is because that's clearly where the exchange programs belong. It's where outreach programs belong, and so on. And those we need much more creativity and much more resources for those as well.
Would this coordinator also be the one coordinating strategic communication in your view?
Yeah, exactly. No, I think this person has purview over public diplomacy as a whole in all of its dimensions: strategic communications, exchanges, educational programs, and so on. Because the truth is, they need to be, in my view, they need to be coherently integrated together so that they're reinforcing one another. And you know, bureaucratically, you end up having to organize them separately, perhaps. But in terms of strategy and how you implement it, they need to be integrated and be part of a whole where they reinforce each other. This is what the Chinese do. So the Chinese, you know, they're learning from the lessons of Belt and Road. So I'll give you an example of one that I just read about, a program that the Chinese have called the Luban workshops. They now have 27 of these workshops in 24 countries, and they're teaching people who live there, young people who live there, technical skills. whether it's electronics or plumbing or welding or a host of other technical skills. And these are very popular. The skills that are taught are determined by the host country, not by the Chinese. And it's to also provide people who live in those countries with the skills to be able to participate in the Belt and Road projects, to be able to make a contribution. So, and this is something that's been really embraced. And there are a couple of countries in Europe that have signed up for these workshops. So it's just that one of many examples. You know, the Chinese have discovered that the Confucius Institutes were a little blatant in their, going beyond teaching Mandarin in universities. I think ultimately they had there were Confucius Institutes in like 87 or something U.S. universities, but they were basically staffed and funded by the Chinese government, and essentially were not only propaganda vehicles for the Chinese, but also a means of sort of supervising or overseeing the behavior of Chinese students in those American universities. So we need to have these kinds of exchanges, these kinds of activities, but we need to do them on our own terms. We don't need to imitate the Chinese. We're far more creative than that. But it's a measure of the breadth of the programs they have going. Is the only reason I'm mentioning them is that it's not just radios and television and so on. It's broad educational. They have huge programs. The Chinese have huge programs for training foreign journalists, bringing those journalists to Beijing to be taught how to be journalists. Well, go figure. If you're going to be a Chinese trained journalist, where is your allegiance going to be? Technical skills and so on. So this is a very comprehensive program that the Chinese have, and I don't think the Congress is aware of just how extensive it is and how feeble our own efforts are by comparison. And the truth is, if we can avoid a military confrontation with China, if we can avoid a war, this competition is going to be fought in the same way that the competition with the Soviet Union was fought, through non-military instruments of power. And it's those non-military instruments of power that we have allowed to atrophy since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, that's right. Would and DOD would be part of this construct you're talking about with the coordinator and as part of the strategic? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, great.
I think everybody has to be a part of it. I mean, you can't have DOD off on its own with its own strategic communications. Right. I mean, I think I read somewhere, I should have known this number from when I was in the job, but I think the DOD, its budget far outweighs the budget of the State Department for this stuff. I think the DOD spends like $1 billion a year
I'm sure.
on strategic communications. And in terms of, you referred to personnel, Condi Rice used to give me a hard time that I had more people in military bands than she had in the Foreign Service. And truth is, it's pretty accurate.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, before we turn over to Joan, I wanted to ask you one more question that maybe is a little bit about your personal experience. But did you have a moment or moments in your career that you can share with us where you particularly perceived the value of PD or maybe the cost of its absence?
Well, in terms of the value, I mean, I'm going to date myself here, but I mean, I joined the CIA in 1966. We were right in the heart of the Cold War. It was the toughest, some of the toughest years of the Cold War were still to follow. And we had an extraordinary capability in USIA and the radios and so on. And I remember meeting a Pakistani general one time, and he told me he'd learned English in a USIA library. And the reason he went to the USIA library was that it was the only place in Karachi he could get into that had air conditioning. But the extent of our exchange programs, our educational exchange programs in Europe and in the developing world the communications that we had through the radios. I would also say we had a tremendous offensive strategic communications capability. I mean, at CIA, we infiltrated, we smuggled millions of copies of miniaturized copies of the Gulag Archipelago into the Soviet Union, where they'd be read until the pages fell apart. We infiltrated VHSs or VHS tapes. We sent in cassettes. We had a very aggressive program that was very complementary to the overt programs in terms of carrying our message to the people behind the Iron Curtain and inside the Soviet Union itself. So I think strategic communications played a huge role in the outcome of the Cold War. I think if I were to point to a period where it's not working, where we don't have that capability, in all honesty, as best I can tell, it's right now.
Joan?
Thank you. What a fascinating exposition, Dr. Gates. You pretty much universally been kind of negative about what's going on right now, and certainly take your point about China. Although I would note that kind of in recent sort of months, China's taken a little bit dive economically. They've scaled back on Belt and Road somewhat. They've obviously got the same demographic challenges we have. They certainly haven't won the hearts and minds of people about going to China. I don't see people lining up to go to China the way they line up to come to the United States. So I guess my question really is, what do you see positive that we are doing, and what are those positive things we should be doing more of, other than kind of, more programs, more exchanges? Is there anything sort of on an overarching level that you would point to that we specifically could do immediately?
Well, first of all, so USIA was replaced by the Bureau of Public Diplomacy and Education in the State Department. The undersecretary's position running that has been vacant 40% of the time since it was created after USIA disappeared. It's been vacant 90% of the time under President Trump and President Biden. The good news is we now have an undersecretary, Liz Allen. I've met and worked with Liz Allen, got to know her some at one of our forums, and she's terrific. I think she has great aspirations and great ideas and plans for dealing with some of the problems that we've just been talking about. But she needs to be empowered. And what's missing is a government-wide strategy that actually the administration needs to take ownership of, and how you bring all those other departments and agencies together. I think our radios still do a good job, and we've created new radios beyond Radio Free Europe, beyond Radio Liberty, and so on. We now have radios for Iran and for others. So I think there are some positive things going on. The challenge is, and we have educational exchanges still going on, although I will say that the Chinese have been very successful in recruiting university students coming from the global South to come to China, in part because of picking up a good bit of the costs and so on, and as well as the other programs that I mentioned with journalists and so on. But still, I think given their choice, most students if they are going to go to college somewhere other than in their own country, the United States is still the country of choice, although there are more and more going to Canada, to Australia, and as I mentioned, to China, in no small part because of some of our immigration problems. So I think we do have a base to build from. There are some very good programs. We have a leader in Liz Allen that I think can be very effective and has great ideas, but she needs to be empowered. The administration needs to have a strategy, and that's, as they say, above her pay grade.
Thank you. I'll turn it back to Mike. I just would make one comment that the radio's budget is about the same as one B-2 bomber for the year. Thank you.
Chat boxes, the Q&A box is filling up, Dr. Gates. First question is from Dr. Nancy Snow. Dr. Gates, thank you for allowing me to submit one of the background papers on Japan's public diplomacy and strategic communication to the Gates Policy Forum. Do you think, as I do, that strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance is a critical component to strengthening U.S. global competitive engagement? As a resident of Japan, I know how life is on the front line of our main competition, including China. I believe U.S.-Japan relationship is far too often taken for granted. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think we don't fully appreciate the degree to which our alliances are a unique source of strength for the United States. Both Russia and China, neither Russia nor China have allies. They have clients, but they don't have allies. So our alliances are hugely important. And one facet of this integration of capabilities that I'm talking about, it needs to be done, as I've just been talking about, on the U.S., within the U.S. government. But I also think we miss an opportunity in terms of better coordination and integration of the efforts with our allies. All of our allies have their own strategic communications programs. And I think if we had a closer, if there was some kind of a forum, whether it's in NATO or elsewhere, that provides a vehicle for the United States to better coordinate our strategic communications efforts with those of our allies and friends in terms of presenting the strength of democracies, in terms of the strength of our economies, of presenting the positive side of what's going on. The Chinese have the field to themselves in terms of identifying all of our problems and all the things that we have to deal with, challenges we have to deal with internally. But I think we could do a better job in working with our allies of a coordinated approach that talks about the benefits of democracy and human rights and so on.
Next question comes from Barry Fulton. Can an effective PD strategy be developed and executed within the State Department?
I think it's like, here's the thing that made the AIDS HIV coordinator work. That individual was empowered by the president. That individual had access to the president and to the Secretary of State and to the National Security Advisor. So the key is, if it's going to be in state, it has to be with the full backing of the president, and under him, the National Security Advisor and the NSC. They have to empower this individual. There's only the State Department can't make the Defense Department coordinate with it, but the NSC can do that. The NSC can make these other departments of government, speaking for the president, make these other departments cooperate and coordinate. So I think operationally it has to, and bureaucratically it has to be in a department of government, and that's the State Department. But the only way it works is if everybody in the government knows that it has 100% backing of the president and subordinate to him, the National Security Council staff and National Security Advisor. And that's where having this individual be a member of the Deputies Committee or the Principals Committee at the NSC is so important, so that people understand this person has the support of the president.
Next question from Ambassador Larry Wohlers. What is the distinction between this PEPFAR-like coordinator and R? And I think maybe you just got to some of that. R being the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs.
Well, the Undersecretary at present does not really have any sway over anyone else in government. And so she basically has oversight over the educational and exchange programs, over communications and so on. But she really has no clout to touch the other elements of government, these other 13 departments and 48 agencies. And so, I'm open to the possibility that the person who gets empowered is in fact the undersecretary who becomes that coordinator. I don't have a strong view one way or the other on that, whatever works. I was just using the PEPFAR coordinator as an example of somebody that had been empowered by the president and where it worked. And because that individual primarily, and this was the key, every budget proposal in another agency having to do with HIV/AIDS and international had to go through this PEPFAR coordinator. So when you've got oversight and control of people's budgets, let's just say their hearts and minds follow.
Yeah. This next question is from board member Joe Johnson. U.S. support of Israel's war against Hamas after its terrorist assault has aroused hostility in the Arab world, magnified by the media. If we had robust strategic communication assets and interagency coordination, how would our position be different?
Well, I think we would be in a position to better differentiate Hamas from the Palestinian people and draw the contrast between a world where reconciliation between Israel and the Arab states was proceeding and giving rise in many respects to a new Middle East, including a relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that opportunity for long-term reconciliation was blown up by Hamas on October 7th. It remains to be seen whether what's going on in Gaza today is simply pauses that reconciliation process, or whether it potentially reverses it. And I think if we had a better coordinated, better, more robust communications capability, we would be able better to draw some of those distinctions and differences to audiences, at a minimum to the elites in these countries.
Okay. The next question is from Richard LeBaron, it's interesting, I think. Can we once and for all stop referring to strategic communications and engagement as soft power? Words matter. Soft makes these instruments of power sound unimportant.
Works for me.
Thought it might. And here's one from Daniel Robinson. Secretary Gates may not be aware of this.
I prefer to use, when it comes to strategic communications, security assistance, humanitarian assistance, so on, I prefer to use the more encompassing term non-military instruments of power.
Okay. Daniel Robinson asks, Dr. Gates may not be aware that since 2023, Voice of America began ordering its journalistic staff not to undertake advocacy, in quotes, in the course of their daily reporting. This is an interesting issue and comes after years in which U.S. AGM reporters were found to be doing just that, as well as violating guidelines that were supposed to prevent political bias appearing in agency content. Also, recently, VOA was sharply criticized on Capitol Hill for an internal order to its staff not to describe Hamas as terrorists. What's Dr. Gates's reaction to all of this, and could a new management approach for this agency deal with problems like this?
All I can say is that going back decades, there have been internal conflicts in the radios, and between the radios and the board that oversaw them, and within that board, and so on. And I think that these internal conflicts and disputes over policies and so on have hampered the effectiveness. I think that particularly when it comes to VOA, and this is just my personal opinion, one of the benefits of VOA is the degree to which it is seen as objective. And it tells it is accurate in terms of what's going on in the United States, as it is accurate in describing what's going on around the world. Its editorial policies have been a source of controversy, like I said. I mean, going back at least to the Carter administration, because I remember watching this big Brzezinski try and wrestle with these big fights going on within the radios and so on. And we really just need to get past that.
The next question comes from Patricia Kushlis. Pat is a PDCA board member who lives in New Mexico. You talk about the importance of focusing on members of Congress, but it's the voters who elect them and the journalists who cover the issues. How would you deal with them and their influence on Congress?
I think that the media is so fragmented today that trying to get a consistent message to the American people writ large is a very daunting challenge. I think, it's the Congress that will make the decisions about this. And the truth is, it's a little bit like foreign assistance, development assistance. To the degree Americans know anything about it, they're generally opposed. Why are we spending all this money building infrastructure in some other, or schools in some other country when we have problems of our own? And for decades, through the whole existence of these programs, it has been members of Congress who have understood, first of all, how little we actually spend on these things in terms of a percentage of the budget, but also who understand how they fit into broader U.S. national security strategy. And I think it has to work in reverse. It requires getting members of Congress to understand the challenge and the benefits of these programs. And so they are in a position when they get questions on it back home, they're in a position to answer, give an informed answer about why it's important. I think trying to reach 360 million people with this message is in the too hard box. So I think you have to start with Congress, certainly with the media. I think bringing the media in and more exposure from the media about what we're doing and what we need to do and so on is important. But I think it essentially has to start with the Congress.
Yeah, I'd agree with that based on my own advocacy experience. And also, just to add from my perspective, not all constituents are created equal, and university presidents on the academic side and chambers of commerce on the practical exchanges kind of side can be very, very helpful allies.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. This question for Michael
Speaking
Schneider.
as a former president of Texas A&M, I wholeheartedly agree.
You might have noticed I'm a graduate of UT, but
that's all right.
No hard feelings. No hard feelings. Michael Schneider, do you believe the U.S. should seek to renew exchanges with China?
I do. I think that we cannot completely separate ourselves from China. I think that would be a mistake. And I think these exchanges, I'm also the national chairman of the Eisenhower Fellowships, and we bring people in from around the world every year. Mid-level professionals, and we send Americans abroad and to almost every country. And we have a China program. And I think that these kinds of programs are really important in terms of keeping the lines of communication open. And just to give you an example of how integrated we are in many respects with China compared to the Soviet Union, just two statistics. Last year, our overall trade with China was $720 billion. It's gone down this year, but last year, the biggest ever, $720 billion. In the last normal year of the Soviet Union, 1986, quote unquote normal, our trade with the Soviet Union was $2 billion. So we have a very different relationship with China than we had with the Soviet Union. and China has a different role in the world than the Soviet Union did. And they are the biggest trading partner of 120 countries, more than 120 countries. So to pretend they don't exist or to cut off all links with China, I think would be a terrible mistake. And I think, you know, we have to do the right things in terms of preventing them from getting technologies, just as we did with the Soviet Union, that enabled them to advance their weapons programs and so on. But in terms of broader people-to-people exchanges and communications, I wish that we had a direct communications link between our militaries. And I hope that will be established sometime soon. So yes, I think we should continue those exchanges.
I've just been notified that Senator Humphrey has a question. Gordon? Gordon, you there?
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to push the unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Mike. Dr. Gates, you've a number of times spoken of the Office of Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and it's our new Undersecretary, Elizabeth Allen, who is, as you have stated, eminently well qualified in terms of experience and expertise, but also her close connection to the president, whom she served as Director of Communications during the period of time he was vice president. So there's already a personal link, if you will, between the president and Undersecretary Allen. But as you've also pointed out, there's nothing in statute anywhere that authorizes the Undersecretary to be that coordinator of all of these agencies, 13 departments and 48 agencies, to use your figures, who are all off doing their own thing. So my question is this: you and others have lamented the fact that no one is in charge for years now, and nothing changes. How can you and we get the attention of the president or the national security advisor or the secretary of the state to get them to focus on this deficiency and fix it? Nothing, it wouldn't be that difficult for the president to designate the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy as that person, and for Congress ultimately to back that up with statute. How can we get that done at last?
Well, I've gotten a lot of questions, and that's the one that I have to admit I don't have the answer to. You know, President Bush did the AIDS coordinator without legislation. I mean, all you have to do is basically say, if you have any money you spend on strategic communications, and OMB could be the oversight element of this, has to be coordinated through the Undersecretary at State. And there could be an interagency body chaired by the Undersecretary to carry that out. As you say, it's really just a matter of getting the attention of the president above all, because it's going to have to be the president that sits down and says to Lloyd Austin and to Gina Raimondo and to the other cabinet secretaries, here's the way we're going to do this public diplomacy going forward in terms of a more coherent approach. So I had hoped through the op-ed, through the report that we did last January, that it would begin to get attention and focus people's attention on the need to get on this. The irony is, the more complicated the world becomes and the more challenges we face, going back to the first thing I said in this discussion, the more necessary this effort is. And I'm not quite sure, Gordon, you're basically talking about how do you get the attention of 2 or 3 people and then force some action on it. But
may I answer the question?
Please.
Okay, Dr. Robert M. Gates should write another op-ed that lays out what needs to be done explicitly and as simply as you've just stated. I mean, sometimes the simplest things need to, who said it? Churchill, that the obvious needs to be restated over and over. So it's the solution. The problem is in plain sight. The solution is in plain sight, but somehow it doesn't get done. So please write another op-ed and tell them how to do it. Thank you. Is that a yes? Is that a yes?
A smile.
Thanks, Gordon. We have two versions of this same question. I'm going to use the one from Ambassador Greta Morris. How can we have effective public diplomacy in the Middle East, particularly with the Israel-Gaza situation, when there are so many divisions within our own society?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a very tough question. And I think, actually, I think one approach is to start by being honest about the divisions within our own society, that there are different points of view on this struggle within the United States itself. I think that, again, going back to the point about VOA, trying to describe this factually and accurately, for example, that this all began with a horrible terrorist attack by Hamas. And because of Hamas, innocent Israelis have been killed and innocent Palestinians have been killed. But we can't let anybody forget how this started. And beyond that, I think being honest in our public diplomacy that there are different points of view within the United States is the honest way to go, and maybe helps people in the region understand that we understand that this is complicated.
Thank you. This one from Arthur Berger, a PDCA member. How do we use social media more effectively during wartime, especially to explain our policies of support for Israel and counter Hamas's propaganda and its outreach to media in Europe and the US?
Well, I confess here, I'm not very familiar with what we are doing in terms of social media right now. Maybe that's partly because I don't do social media, but I will tell you this, and let me answer in maybe a different way. I think we have not been nearly aggressive enough in carrying our message to people, to the average citizen in either Russia or China. I remember how aggressive our programs were during the Cold War, both overt and covert, in getting our message through. And that worries those governments. I mean, it's not for nothing that back in 2012 and in that area that Putin shut down all the NGOs operating, the National Endowment for Democracy and so on and so forth in Russia. And that they go to such lengths to prevent their people from having access to outside points of view. One of the things I believe, and I think a number of us believe in the Cold War, made a huge difference was when people, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union, were able to gain access to both Scandinavian and West German television, and they saw how the rest of the world was living compared to the way they were living. And so I think we need to be more aggressive in, I mean, go figure how aggressive the Russians have been in their disinformation programs here in the United States, probably the Chinese as well. And we don't need to do disinformation. One of the great benefits we had in the Cold War was with all of our strategic communications, all we had to do was tell the truth. And people behind the Iron Curtain knew it was the truth because they could witness it every single day. And so I think we differentiate ourselves, first of all, from both Russia and China in not doing disinformation, but rather reporting the facts, but being more aggressive and getting that information to those populations so that they know what their governments are doing.
Here's a question that has recurred in a couple of forms, but this one's from Matthew Wallen. To what extent do you think that the troubles the U.S. faces in its public diplomacy message and image are a result of inconsistencies in its professed ideals versus the realities people see? The unfiltered view of the world now gets through 24/7 media coverage and social media, compounded with the state of politics in the U.S., presents major challenges to what the U.S. says it stands for. Do people expect the U.S. to do better today, and even more than they did in the past?
I think that we have I think part of our image problem around the world is that no one is more critical of the United States than people in the United States. We are all, and this is not new. We have always been very open about all the challenges we face and the differences we have, and that democracy is an ugly, hard business, and that we fall short of our aspirations. But it seems to me that the messaging to the rest of the world, and maybe sometimes to ourselves, should be more along the lines, even our founders knew they were establishing principles and a form of government that we aspire to, but will always fall short of. Because what they said in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence was, as the Constitution says, a more perfect union. What differentiates the United States from nearly every other country, and certainly from the authoritarian countries, is we have always recognized our shortcomings. And no country over more than 2 centuries has worked harder or at greater cost to overcome its shortcomings and to realize its aspirations. And we continue to do that. We are a society and a culture that is always changing and trying to improve itself and to live up to the standards that that the founders set for us. They knew they'd created a flawed system. It began with a huge compromise with respect to slavery, that the consequences of which we've lived with since the beginning. But we've always tried to move forward and be better and to achieve those aspirations. And it seems to me that we need more of that kind of honesty, and then ask the rhetorical question, no matter what country we're beaming our information to, how about your government? Does your government work that hard? Does your society work that hard to overcome its shortcomings? We may have our faults, but at least we recognize them and are trying to deal with them.
Here's a question from Lynn Weil, who asks you about your proposal for empowering the Undersecretary of State. Have you, I'm embellishing on our question a little bit, but have you discussed this with any members of leaders in Congress, and what kind of reaction have you got?
Well, in our gathering, in our forum where we had tackled this subject of strategic communications, the report that Gordon referred to at the very beginning of the program, we actually had members of Congress participating. We had Senator Todd Young of Indiana, a Republican, and we had Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. We had the staff director of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So we had members of Congress, and I think both of the senators have become very strong advocates for doing something about this strategic communications problem. And they were very much part of the discussions about empowering somebody to be able to bring about a coherent strategy and coherent implementation of that strategy in the government.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Young, I believe, was a Lugar staffer, so it sounds like that tracks. Another question from Mike Schneider. To what extent do you believe the USG, through the State Department, can or should inform the public of international perceptions of American society and U.S. policies? Going beyond simply informing the public, are there activities the USG, through state and cooperating agencies, to better engage internationally?
I think that the State Department communicating with the American people is a bit treacherous ground. And one of the things that has dominated the debates about VOA and the radios and so on is that it doesn't bounce back as a means of influencing people in the United States. So programs that are aimed back at the American people from a basically foreign policy institution, I think have to be considered very, very carefully. And I would say coordinated very closely, not only with the White House, but with the Congress, because I think the perception of trying to influence, using, in essence, foreign policy money to try and influence American thinking is pretty risky. And we've been down this road before several decades ago. And all I'll just say is I think it's very tricky ground, and I'd be very cautious about it.
Lauren Hurst asks, in a foreign affairs piece, Ambassador Nicholas Burns characterized diplomacy as gardening and ultimately driven by human relations. How does public diplomacy strategy embrace this gardening approach in an often divisive digital environment?
Well, first of all, I would say I think the first person I heard use that term gardening as what diplomacy is about was George Shultz, but I think that public diplomacy is very much part of the gardening. It's basically what I would call long-term investing, and Walter Lippmann had a phrase that public service is often planting seeds for trees you may never get to sit under. And I think in some ways the exchange programs, the cultural exchanges, the educational exchanges, and so on, are planting seeds. And you don't know how and when they may sprout, but you've got to make the investment. And I think it creates an environment in which people can talk openly with one another. Look, these programs began under President Eisenhower and his people-to-people programs of exchanges. And Eisenhower believed firmly that the better people, not officials, but educators or sports figures or musicians or others, the more people got to know each other across borders, the better the chances for peace. And I believe that. And I think you have to see it. You can't do a mathematical formula about where it's going to benefit the United States. You're never going to know. But when you get a new Czech government or a new Polish government in 1989, and they say that the radios were what kept them alive and kept them full of hope, those were seeds we had no idea where they would sprout, and yet it had a huge impact.
I know we're running short of time, but one quick question here. This is from Tamari Kamiadashvili, and apologies if I didn't get the name quite right. If you were advising the new undersecretary, what would you suggest is, particularly starting so late in the administration, how should she focus her priorities at this point?
Well, I think that the first priority would be to undertake to develop a broad national public diplomacy strategy, and if that, and I think it should originate there, but then go through the interagency process because you're going to need to get all the agencies on board. But if you could get something like that established, get it approved, that establishes a roadmap for moving forward as a government, and get it approved by this administration, it may be one of those things that is continued by the next administration, no matter who the president is. There are a couple of examples of this. The Abraham Accords were initiated under the Trump administration and were continued by the Biden administration. The Quad began under the Trump administration. It was a Japanese initiative, but the Trump administration embraced it, and so has the Biden administration. So I think if you could get a strategy in place that makes sense, there's a good chance, and particularly if you could get congressional support for it, then I think you have the chance of the next administration picking up that ball and running with it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gates. This was really enlightening, and I know from the numbers of questions in the box, it really resonated with our members. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Joel, over to you.
Good luck.
Well, strategy, resources, staffing, coherent coordination, educate members of Congress. Dr. Gates, you've given us much to think about. As we organize around this agenda at this critical juncture, we hope to be able to continue to rely on your counsel, and that you will be available to us. In the meantime, thank you sincerely for your time today. And a word of gratitude to today's moderator, Mike McCary, and our event coordinators, PDCA Program Committee Co-Chair Joan Maurer and immediate past President Sherry Mueller, and to our tech hosts, Gabby Stahl, PDCA Tom Tuck Graduate Fellow, and PDCA Rising Professional Haley Pottle. Okay, well, join us next Monday, November 6th at noon for our November 1st Monday Forum featuring former PDC President Adam Clayton Powell III and USC Election Cybersecurity Manager Judy Kahn, talking about their current project, Election Cybersecurity with a Public Diplomacy Prism. This will be a hybrid program, both in person and online. The in-person program will take place at the Lindner Family Commons of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, 1957 East Street Northwest. We will have a light lunch and ask that everyone grab a sandwich and be in your seats by 11:55 a.m. The program will begin at noon. Registration information for both is on the landing page of the PDCA website. If you can't find registration information, you're welcome to email me at president@publicdiplomacy.org. Glad all of you could be with us today. These programs are brought to you by the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, the GWU Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. We will see you next Monday, November 26th. November 6th, I'm sorry.